Okay, let's go in. Okay, thank you for your patience. Let me share the screen. And so this section of law is a little bit more down to earth. Although some of the examples that we're speaking about may not be directly relevant to us, but I think the concept of personal responsibility for damages, in this case by animals that you own, and certain methods are a little bit more tangible than some of the laws of Tumah and Tahara. So I hope it's a welcome shift. Okay, so you can see the screen. Let me make it slightly bigger. And we begin. Okay, so we've learned to assume you've learned the two terms tam and muad. Muad basically, which means forewarned, is the sense that we can anticipate that an animal will behave in a particular way, and therefore the owner will be held liable for damages caused in that particular way. Now, the most common type of damage that the animal is always considered muad for is the category that we refer to as shane. Shane literally translates as teeth. It really means what the animal will eat. Okay, and when are you liable for full damages? When the damage is caused within the property of the damagee, the nizak. Okay, so that's the halacha. That's what we're going to start with, and we'll see different kind of derivatives of that, balancing the responsibilities of all parties. So the halacha begins. The Rambam, first halacha in chapter 3, is taken for granted that an animal is prone to eat fruit, vegetables, or the like. Therefore, if an animal enters a domain belonging to another person and eats produce that it would normally eat, okay, we'll see that that's a proviso. The owner of the animal is liable for the entire amount of the damages. This is explicitly what the pasuk is talking about when it says, and if he shall send forth his animal, and they shall pasture in another's fields, payment should be exacted from his choice field. Right? When you pay full damages, you've got to pay from your best produce as opposed to paying half damage when it comes to animal. It comes from the value of the animal, which we've touched on. If the animal ate produce belonging to another person in a public domain, okay, then the owner is not liable. And obviously here the balance is that the person who has produce in the public domain also needs to be aware that anything can happen to it and needs to bear responsibility for that. So although I need to be responsible for my animal and know that my animal might eat in a public domain, it's not only my responsibility, it's also the responsibility. And as we see, the halacha understands the primary responsibility of the person who had that food out there, which would be normal animal food. It rests with that person, and therefore, if my animal ate, I'm not liable. Now, what is if the animal benefits from eating the produce? And we'll see what that means in the next halacha. Then the owner must pay for the benefit his animal received, but not for the damage caused. So what are we talking about? Halacha 2. What is implied? If an animal entered another person's domain and ate sesame seeds, chestnuts, or the like that were worth a dinner, the owner must pay a dinner. Now, here's the thing. These foods are more expensive than regular animal fodder, and it's not usual that the animal will eat it. It's certainly not something that someone would regularly feed their animals because of the expense. It's usually be, I guess, barley or whatever, depending on what the animal is. So he said like this: if the animal ate these foods in the public domain, this is the point. This is the explanation of the second part of the previous halacha. So what if it ate these foods in a public domain, then and derived benefit? Sorry, let's just be clear. So in the first instance, if your animal goes into somebody else's property, eats it, even though it's something that's more expensive that you don't usually feed it, but it's food that an animal would eat, then you got to pay for the full damage because that's what it's about. Your animal went and ate in somebody else's property. But if it happened in the public domain and derived benefit, then we consider these foods as if they were barley or fodder, and the owner is required to pay the wholesale price of fodder or barley. That means like this: if you hadn't served your animal breakfast yet, and it goes out into the marketplace and finds a bucket of sesame seeds and eats her fill, then because your animal benefited, meaning you benefited because you saved money on the feed you would have given him, so you're liable to pay that benefit, not the damage, not the full price of this more expensive product, but the benefit that you had. Okay, because basically this guy now, your animal now has eaten breakfast on that guy's account, and you would pay for that, that extra benefit. Halacha 3, if the animal ate food that are harmful to it. So the examples in the previous one is it's food that the animal can eat, and it's it gives the animal its necessary nutrition, whatever. But you don't usually feed it that because of the expense. What about if it was a food that was harmful to the animal? E.g., it ate wheat. So this is a cow. It seems a cow eating wheat it's not good for it, I think. So since it did not derive any benefit because it ate, but it's unhealthy, then the owner is not liable. If it ate substances that it would not usually eat, meaning stuff that's not food, like a garment or a utensil, then the owner shall pay half damages. Why do you all of a sudden start paying? Because now it falls under a different category of damage. Now it falls in the category of damage of carrion because it's not expected, right? Here you pay in the damagee's property because it's expected when it eats. But if it eats something that it wasn't expected to eat, it's not muad for that. It's not forewarned for that because we don't expect it to do that type of thing. So then you'll pay like all other cases, which is like a tam, you pay half damage. And he says, and that's why he says this applies both in the private domain and in the public domain. The rationale is that this is a deviation. Hence, the owner is liable for only half the damages. He is liable for damage caused in the public domain, however, because it is the ordinary practice of people to leave their utensils or garments in the public domain while they rest. In other words, the last point that I'm saying is, if it's in the public domain, maybe you shouldn't be liable anything. So he's saying no, because at the end of the day, I, as an owner of an animal, need to be aware that sometimes people do leave things around, and I have to be, I have to be concerned about my animal's behavior. Obviously, I can't expect him to do things unusual, but if he did go ahead and damage, I got to pay half because the damage was nonetheless done, and I wasn't obviously paying close enough attention. Halacha 4. There's a doubt regarding the liability of the owner when his animal is standing in the private domain. So there's the scenario: he's standing in the private domain, but takes produce belonging to the owner of the private domain from the public domain and eats it in that private domain. So your neighbor has just packed his bakkie with produce, and somehow your animal walked into your neighbor's garden. The neighbor closed the gate, and his bakkie is now outside in the public domain, and your animal is in his garden and sticks its head over and eats the produce. So where did it get the produce from? It got the produce from the public domain, but he's eating it in the private domain of the person whose produce it is. So he says this is a doubtful situation because you're not fulfilling all the criteria of the pasuk, which is eating someone's produce in their property because it came from the public domain. So he says, therefore, the owner is liable only for the benefit his animal derived, meaning akin to eating in the public domain. If the person whose property was damaged seizes possession of the full worth of the damage caused by the animal, it should not be expropriated from him. Okay, so if the nizak got angry, he sees my cow eating from his bakkie, and he runs and he grabs something that he knows is of equal value, although I can only be made liable to pay him the benefit the animal had, which would be a small portion of the total amount. If he already took that, we don't expropriate it back from him. He gets to keep it. In other words, because the point is there's a doubt here. There's an argument to say that he gets full damages, right? And there's an argument to say he doesn't get any damages. So we say you pay, normally you would pay the benefit that your animal had, but in that case, you would not take it back from him if he managed to grab something of value for the damage. Okay, because at the end of the day, this is the point that I'm answering, because at the end of the day, it was eaten in his domain, even though the food was taken from a public space. Halacha 5, when the dog enters a courtyard, took bread or meat, brought it into the public domain or to another courtyard and ate it there, the owner should pay for the benefit the dog received. In other words, the point is, we look at the liability in the place where it was eaten, not where it was taken from in this instance. Now, if the dog ate food in a field that belonging to the owner of the courtyard, so again, the dog went into courtyard of Ruvain and then ran off into the field of Ruvain, then the dog's owner must pay the full extent of the damages as if it had been eaten in the courtyard, because it was not eaten it was eaten in a domain belonging to the person whose property was damaged. In other words, I guess what the Rambam is clarifying, it's not about the fact that in the first part of the law that the dog moved it from its original space. right? It's about the fact that it's in somebody else's property or in the public domain. That's why you're only liable for benefit and not the actual damage. But if the animal moved it from Ruvain's courtyard to Ruvain's field, even though it was moved, you still pay full amount. And the same law applies, he says, to all analogous situations. Halacha 6. Following rule applies when an animal eats foods that it would not ordinarily eat, but would eat under constraint. Okay? So this is another category. We've had food that it usually eats. We had food that it would eat, but people don't feed it because it's too expensive. We had things that it would never really eat, right? And we said that's a different type of damage. Now we're talking about things that it would eat if it was needed to, as if it was kind of forced to. He gives some examples. A cow that ate barley, a donkey that ate fish or fish, a pig that ate a piece of meat, a dog that licked oil, or a cat that ate dates and the like. So if the foods were eaten in a domain belonging to the person whose property was damaged, so it's in their property, the owner must pay the entire amount of the damage, because even though it's not usual food, but it is food that it would eat, similar to the way you would be liable for food that was more expensive than you would usually feed it. Because at the end of the day, it still comes under the category of shame, tooth, in someone else's property. If the food is eaten in a public domain, he's not liable. Okay? And because it's not considered anything of benefit. If the animal benefited, generally is not liable, but if the animal benefited, the owner must pay for that benefit, similar to when it ate expensive food. It's the same kind of rules. Halacha 7, when a beast enters a private domain, here you're talking about a wild animal, and sees an animal meat and eats it, its owner must pay the full extent of the damage, for this is its ordinary course of behavior. So if you have a pet tiger or cat or lion or wolf or something, and it goes in and eats your neighbor's sheep, you're going to have to pay for it. Whenever a dog eats small sheep, I guess we're talking about more of the type of domesticated dogs, or a cat eats large cocks, this is considered to be a deviation. It's not their usual fare. And therefore, the owner is liable only for half damages. Halacha 8, when there's a basket of bread in a private domain, and a donkey enters and breaks the basket and eats the bread, the owner is liable for the full extent of the damages, for this is a donkey's ordinary behavior. And as a donkey, in order to get the food that it wants, it will break whatever's in the way. So therefore, it's not considered an unusual activity for the donkey that it broke this basket. It's still under the category of what's expected of it. Okay. Similarly, if a goat sees a turnip or the like on the opening of a jug, and then so the goat jumps for it or leans on it, and stumbles over the jug and eats the turnip and breaks the jug, the owner must pay the full damages for both. For it is the ordinary pattern for such an animal to hang on to utensils and climb on them in order to eat. Right? Goats will jump all over the place to grab what it wants to eat. And therefore, even though, in other words, we learn about knocking things and treading on things and so on, but because this is in the process of getting to the food that it wanted, it's considered normal behavior, and the owner will pay full damages for that. The same applies in all analogous situations. That's the point. If you can determine that this is what you would expect an animal to do to get its food, if it causes damage to some other utensil in the way, full damages. If the donkey came in and ate the bread and then broke the basket, so it wasn't in the process of attaining its food, then the owner is liable full damages for the bread, obviously, because that's shame, right? It's doing what it's expected, and it's in the damagee's property. But half the damage for the basket, because this wasn't now in the process of getting the food, it was a separate damage, not expected. And the same again applies in all analogous situations. When an animal eats produce in the marketplace, now the marketplace is basically, so earlier we spoke about the public domain. The marketplace is like a designated space where people would have stores and so on and so forth. So what we're going to see is that for the most part, it's considered like a public domain, for the most part. So when an animal eats produce in the marketplace, whether when walking or when standing, its owner must pay only the benefit it received, right? Because the basic rule is he's not liable for damages. He's only liable for benefit. This applies even if the animal turns its head to the corners of the marketplace and eats. If, however, an animal left the marketplace and went and stood at the corner of the marketplace and ate produce, so this is like a tucked away corner, then that's considered already more like a private space, and the owners must pay for the damages. If the animal ate from produce in the storefront, the owner must pay only for the benefit it received. The storefront is still considered more like the public domain. If it ate from the produce within the store, so the animal stuck its head into the store, then he must pay full extent of the damages, even though it's standing outside, but if it sticks its heads in and eats from there, it would have to pay. Stephen, I see you put a question. We'll come back to it in a moment. Halacha 10. If an animal is walking in the public domain and stretches out its neck and ate from the produce that was loaded onto another animal's back, its owner must pay only for the benefit it received, for it is common for animals to eat from a load being carried by another. Now, the point that we're saying is that the person who had loaded the animal with food must be aware that other animals may eat from it. The primary responsibility is for them to make sure that their food on the back of the animal is protected. This law applies even when the animal stands. Okay, so even though it's stopped, it's still going to be the person that the damaging animal would only pay for benefit, but not for damage, because it's like the public domain and it's expected. If it jumps, if a small animal jumped onto a big animal to eat from the produce that was loaded onto the other animal's back, then the owner of the animal must pay full extent of damages, because the back of another animal is considered to be the private domain of the person who suffered the damage. The animal belongs to that owner and the food, so it's like jumping into his property and eating food there. The normal case of shame, damages of the tooth, which he's liable fully for. Halacha 11, if an animal slips on a stone or on its urine and falls into a garden of fruit and vegetables, or if it eats from the garden. So this is what happens. Basically, the point is that somehow by accident, your animal ended up in somebody else's property. And either as it fell, it destroyed some produce, or because it now fell into somebody else's property and looks around and sees there's food there, starts eating it. Okay? So even if it walks from one row to another row, and even if it stays the entire day, so it eats up a lot of damage, basically, he is required to pay only for the benefit it received. Okay, so the point is like this, is that I'm liable for the damage my animal causes when it goes into somebody else's property because I was negligent in not ensuring that it wouldn't wander into somebody else's property. But if my animal ended up in somebody else's property in a way that was beyond my control, by way of accident, then I'm not liable for that. So I'll pay for the benefit, but not for the damage. Now, we gave two scenarios. Either he fell in and then ate, or fell and damaged as it fell. So he says, what benefit could it have received from falling? Meaning, imagine your animal fell into somebody else's property, squashed a bunch of tomatoes, and then you take it out immediately. Where's the what are you going to pay for? So he says the benefit is that it fell on a soft place and did not crush its limbs. So you'd have to measure up what type of benefit that is to the owner, and you would pay for that. If unconscious, an animal descended into a private property in an ordinary manner and ate produce, the owner must pay the full extent of the damages. That's the classic case that we learned right at the outset of this halakha. Now, even if it's soil produce with its afterbirth, this is the point. In other words, if it caused damage other than by eating it. So what happened is your animal walks in your cow and then it gives birth. And because of the afterbirth and whatever, it damages the food that's there, the owner must pay the full extent of damages because the first stage involved negligence. Here the Rambam is referring to a principle that if tchilasa v'pshia, in other words, if it entered into somebody else's property as a result of me, the owner's negligence, then even if what happened there in the other person's property was beyond my control, like the animal just suddenly gave birth, it wasn't expected, I couldn't have expected what was going to happen in that moment, nonetheless, I'm fully liable. Okay, that's the uniqueness of this case. Similarly, if it was pushed by another animal and fell, again, the owner must pay the full extent of the damages because he should have had them pass one by one so that they would not push each other. Again, the assumption is a few of your animals that you were trying to squeeze somewhere too soon, too much together, and the one pushed the other one into somebody else's property. So you were being negligent by not guiding your animals in a way that they weren't going to knock one another over. So the point is that even if the damage that comes is the result of something that you could not have anticipated because you were negligent and that's what allowed the animal to enter other person's property, you liable for all the damage. Halacha 12, if it slipped and fell into another person's garden, so this was an accident, ended up in somebody else's garden. Now it departed and then returned to that garden, the owner must pay the full extent of damages, even if it is returned without his knowledge. Okay? And the reason is because he was obligated to watch it and prevent it from returning. You know, as if an animal falls into somebody else's property accidentally once, we assume that now it knows how to get in. So the owner has to be more vigilant of this animal to make sure it doesn't go there. And he can't say, oh, it was not expected. For it is known that if an animal knows the way to the garden, it will turn on its own initiative. Okay. Halacha 13, when a potter, okay, so that was all the animals. Now slightly different perspective. A potter brings his wares into a person's courtyard without his permission. So I bring in all these dishes, pottery, clay. And an animal belonging to the owner of the courtyard broke the pottery. So the owner of the courtyard and the animal is not liable. I put it there without his permission, and he's got animals. I, as the potter, have to realize the risk. Moreover, if the animal is injured, not only that, right? If your animal now gets cut on the pottery that I'll put in there, I'll have to pay you. Okay. Now, what happens if it bought in the wares with the owner's permission? So Reuven says to Shimon, I want to put my stuff in your property. Then the potter is not liable for the animal's injury. So if Shimon's animal gets injured, I'm not liable. And now the next thing, if the owner made a commitment to guard the pottery, he is liable for damages. So Shimon says, there's two steps here, right? If Reuven comes to Shimon and says, can I put my pottery there? Shimon says yes. So if Shimon's animal gets damaged, Reuven's not liable. Now, but what happens if Shimon's animal destroys my pottery without getting hurt? Shimon also doesn't have to pay me because I put my stuff in his property. Unless Shimon said, put it in there and I'll take responsibility for it. If Shimon said, I'll take responsibility for it, then if his animal breaks it, then he would be liable. But otherwise, it's my stuff in his property, so I take that risk. Okay. Halacha 14. Similarly, if a person brought produce into a courtyard belonging to another individual without his permission, and the animal belonging to the owner of the courtyard ate it, the owner of the courtyard is not liable. So I put my produce in your property, your animal ate it, you're not liable. I put it there without permission. If the animal slipped on it and suffered injuries, again, the owner of the produce is liable. I put it there without permission. I'm going to pay. If you brought the produce in with the owner's permission, the owner of the produce is not liable for the animal's injury, as we learned by the pottery, same idea. And if the owner of the courtyard made a commitment to guard the produce, then not only won't I have to pay for your animal's damages, but if your animal ate from it, you would have to pay me. Right? You're following? Now, if the person brought produce into a courtyard without permission, and an animal belonging to the owner of the courtyard ate it and suffered injury because it ate it, the owner of the produce is not liable. So this is interesting, right? Because here, eating is normal. So I wouldn't have to pay. The animal should not have eaten it. And the owner should have seen if the animal's eating, don't allow your animal to overeat. When the owner of the courtyard allowed a person to bring his produce into the courtyard and left the owner of the produce to watch it. So you let me bring my wheat into your property, and then you move away. Now what happens is your animal belonging to the owner of the courtyard ate from the produce and suffered damage. Then the owner of the produce is liable because I should have stopped your animal from eating it, just as you should have stopped your animal from eating it had you been there. Since he saw the animal eating produce and that could damage it and took no action, he is liable. Now, for the owner of the courtyard is not, because as I said, because in that situation, the owner is not there to stop his animal from eating it, but you are there. An incident occurred, and the Rambam obviously learns this halacha straight out of this incident in the Gemara. The Gemara tells a story where a woman goes in to bake in her neighbor's house, and the neighbor leaves her alone because the point over there was that in the process of kneading, should roll up her sleeves, should be presenting herself in a somewhat less than modest way. So he wanted to be out the way. And she's there. While she's there kneading and baking, the goat of the owner eats up the dough and dies. So the sages, in that case, obligated her to reimburse the owner of the goat. And these principles apply in all similar situations. The point was, because she's there, she should have been the one to stop the animal from eating. Even though in an ordinary case, if an animal eats and damages itself, even if you had to put it there without permission, you wouldn't be liable. In this case, you would be. Halacha 15. Final halacha: when a person made a grain heap in a field belonging to a colleague. This is pretty much the same as what we've been saying, just a slightly different product. When a person made a grain heap in a field belonging to a colleague without the latter's permission, and the animal belonging to the owner of the field ate it, the owner of the field is not liable. If the animal slipped on it and suffered injuries, the owner of the produce is liable, right? Same thing. If the animal ate it and suffered injury because it ate it, the owner of the produce is not liable. Again, same thing. If he had permission to make the grain heap, the owner of the field is liable, even if he did not accept the responsibility to guard the grain pot. Now, a further point, once a watchman in the granary says, so this is different to a regular person, right, in his home, right? When I put into a private person's home, he only will be responsible for it if he takes responsibility to guard it. Just granting permission doesn't mean that he's taking full responsibility for it. But once a watchman in a granary says, make your grain heap here, it says if he told him, make your grain heap and I'll guard it for you. Okay, so in those situations, we keep that in mind, what type of liability you'll have if something untoward happens to that produce. Because he's taken responsibility for it, obviously there'll be liability according to that responsibility. I just want to quickly check the Stephen sent a question through while we were learning. Bread is bad for a dog. Rambam principle is that it is not a benefit. If it's bad, yes, correct. In other words, like he says, all analogous situations. If it's a food that would be bad, then it's not a benefit. Yeah. Just like the example I think said barley for a cow, right? As an example again. Okay, let's go to the questions. Let's see how we do here. If an animal eats produce belonging to another person in the public domain, how much does the owner have to pay? Either the worth of the produce that his animal ate, only the benefit the animal received, but not for the damages caused. A or B?
A B.
B is correct.
B.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, let's go on to our next question. If an animal ate foods that are harmful to it, the owner must pay for half the damages it caused. Full damages, nothing. Well, we just had that in the question.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
C.
Oh,
Okay. No, Stephen, that was your
nothing,
question, right?
nothing.
If the dog ate something that's bad for it, then you don't pay. When a dog enters a courtyard, grabs a piece of meat and eats it in the public domain, what is the law? Think carefully. The owner must pay full damages. The owner must pay half damages. The owner is only required to pay for the benefit that his animal received.
Number 3.
Yeah.
Three.
The
Three is correct, right? So again, we look at where it ate it pretty much. That's I think the key that we learn in that halakha. So in other words, even though it went into that guy's property and it was his food, and then it took it out, it doesn't fill the requirements of the pasuk. Okay. Now, the final question: if the owner of a courtyard gave permission to a potter to store his wares in the courtyard, and then his animal broke the pottery, is he liable to pay for the damages? Yes, not unless he made a commitment to guard the pottery.
Number 2.
B.
Number 2.
Right, that was
Number
the
2.
point that kept emphasizing that he can allow him to put it in there. And then if I'm the guy that put the pottery there, if the owner allowed me to put it there, I won't be liable for damages caused to his animal if the animal got hurt. That much I'm not liable for, which I would be if I hadn't got permission. But neither would he be liable for the damages unless he took on that responsibility. Okay.
Yeah. Rabbi,
Yes.
Rabbi,
Sure.
just before we close, could I ask you, I missed the first 2 chapters of this section, and
Yes.
you spoke earlier about Nizkei Mammon. What does that
Yes.
mean?
Niska mama means damages caused by your property.
Damages
own
caused
it.
by?
Mammon, something that you own, and damages caused to other property. So, yeah, as
Thank
opposed
you.
to bodily damage, right?